Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm super excited to show you my custom Mark 1. If you looked at the thumbnail, you might be a little confused as to why Tony's looking like this right now. But the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to put the armor pieces on little by little and talk about all of the modifications to the SH Figuarts that were necessary to make it so that this could be a modular, removable armor system. So, starting off with the base body, this is the Notaman Slim body. And I did modify it. I had to get this neck from a man nipple suited body, which also provided the pinstripe pants, because the Notaman neck didn't really work with this Man Nipple Studio Tony Stark head. And fortunately, that man nipple body also came with this peg that's designed for this neck, and that happened to fit on the Notaman, so it just pops on there. And really, with no modification, it's able to stay on the head. The articulation isn't great. It's mostly just a swiveling a little bit at the base of the neck, but it stays on, and I didn't have to do any dremeling or anything like that. However, I did have to do some dremeling at the bottom of the legs just to get him to be a little bit shorter, because the Notaman bodies are pretty tall. And when I compared it when I was done with my Fantascraft Mark 85 and the Comic Cave Mark 46, this guy was towering over them. So what I did was I just cut about 1/8 of an inch off the legs and then drilled a new hole and stuck the peg back in there, and it works just as it should. And that also helps the pants to get down to the shoes. Before it was kind of like that situation. I also drilled a hole that's the same width as this arc reactor through the entire chest, so I had to perform some Dr. Yinsen surgery on this Tony, and that was so that this whole wiring setup could fit through the chest cavity and have the battery pack on the back. So when you press that button, the light comes on and off. And I'd take it apart, but I've got it pressed down in there pretty firmly, and it's kind of a pain to take apart. So just use your imagination. There's a wire and a 3-volt LED that's running through here. The LED is right there, and the hole is the same width as this arc reactor. This arc reactor comes with the SH Figuarts. You just have to dig for it because it's hidden behind the frosted glass of the original arc reactor. Now, to talk a little bit about the clothing, this is a jacket that I got from eBay. If you just search 1/12 scale brown outfit, this should come up. There's a lot of different varieties of color. It comes with pants as well as the tank top. And I actually used the pants for my Star-Lord customs, so I had a lot of these lying around. So I just dyed the white tank top this kind of grayish green color and cut a little hole in it so that the arc reactor could show through. And I also added these little buttons, which I'll talk about when I do my Star-Lord review, because that's why I got them. They're little tiny studs that are meant for nail design art, and I got them on Etsy. I also cut up the bottom of the jacket, partly because it's accurate to the movie, or at least accurate to the Hot Toys, because the bottom of the jacket is definitely frayed if you look at any reviews of the Hot Toys, but also because it makes it a lot easier for the armor to fit on and not to have a bunch of layers of clothes, especially around the codpiece, because yeah, it was getting pretty tight. The pants, as I mentioned before, are from the Man Nipple Studio pinstripe black suited body. They are a little bit small, but as we learned in Thor Ragnarok, Tony tends to wear very tight pants, so I guess this is character accurate. And they do allow for some pretty good articulation while the armor is off, but like I said, there's a little bit of smallness going on here. But once the armor is all on, the articulation is actually quite a bit worse, which I guess is accurate to the movie. Tony doesn't have a whole lot of mobility in the Mark 1. But the point of this figure is not to be super articulated, it's to be very detailed and to just kind of have a shelf presence. And the level of articulation, as I'll show you, is decent enough to get into some kind of hero poses. So without further ado, let's start putting on the armor, and I'll show you the whole process. The first piece of armor we need to take a look at is the codpiece. Obviously, like I said before, all the armor comes from the SH Figuarts, but this is heavily modified. I had to pop it off and sand it down and glue two of these halves together. You can see the seam line here and here. And all of this interior has been heavily sanded down with a Dremel tool. I re-glued these car battery terminals, and I had to cut out little tiny segments of the very top part here. You can see that lip. I cut out a segment that was just the right size for each of these and glued them in so they were a little more secure. I think originally these were just attached to the torso of the SHF. And then I glued these little elastic straps behind there. And I also drilled tiny little holes for this tiny gauge wire. And this is one length of wire that I've glued to the back here, and it fits into those holes. And then the butt piece was originally attached at this point here with brittle, firm plastic, and it wasn't movable at all. Now it does have some give because I've attached it with some cloth and stretched out the cloth so that it wants to spring back into that position, but it has some give. This is just some elastic string that I'm using as some wiring detail, which will tuck into the other armor plates when we get those on. So to get this guy on, what we want to do is just pop him in half, then shimmy the armor like so, and then simply just reattach. Now let's move on to the next piece of armor. So get both of those out. All of these are separate plates. This, and this. They each have 3 pieces, and they're all attached separately to the SHF, but they are kind of clipped together in the molding. And I've taken some microfiber cloth and dyed it to this kind of leathery looking color. Not only provides structural support, but also a little bit of friction. I also sanded off all of the points where these originally contact and connect with the SHF legs. There's a lot of like pegs that stick out. I just sanded all those down, glued it all together. For the tank treads, I drilled holes right there, there, and there, just because that's how it's supposed to be in the movie. It adds a little bit more depth and realism. Now to do this, you have to take off the shoes. Just pop right off. And these guys just slide right on the thighs. Next up are the shin guards, or the lower legs. These are a little more complicated than simply just snapping off the pieces. That is the case for the knee pads themselves and the pieces that kind of go around the back of the calf. But all of this kind of inner framework here, this was actually molded to the SHF legs, so I had to cut them off using an X-Acto knife. And there were several cases where I accidentally cut through it and I had to glue it back together. I've also added quite a bit of wiring detail here. All of these wires just connect down here, feed through that part, even though they're supposed to go underneath this part here. There's just not enough room between the leg and the metal for the wires to fit through, so I took a little creative liberty and made them go through this back part. And the reason I have them so short is because they all just tuck up under the thigh armor and give the illusion that they continue on, but still allow for it to be modular so that I can take everything apart and not have to deal with wires that circulate throughout the entire figure. So I'll just show you how these go on. They're a little bit more fiddly than the thigh plates because of the way that the pants kind of flare out. You kind of have to wiggle it around, and then you have to worry about getting the wires underneath the thigh plate. And then once those are on, it's a little bit tricky to get the shoes on because all of this armor is relatively fragile. At least it feels like it could snap and break apart. It's never actually broken, but it's broken at the seams where I've glued it, and I've had to re-glue a lot of things. So I always bend the knees like that so that I have a place to push on that's not pushing on the armor. And then the shoes can just pop on like this. It's always so scary to do. All right, that one's on. Doesn't even give me a satisfying pop, does it? Oh, that one did. Nice. Next are the shoes, and these are the simplest part to put on. These Noda Studio boots slash shoes, not only do they look really accurate to the boots that Tony's supposed to be wearing, but they're also weathered, and after I hollowed these out, they happen to fit perfectly inside them. So this was pretty complicated to do. They are not supposed to be removable pieces. The shoes that Tony's wearing in the SHF, which don't have any detail on them, are molded to, not to the bottom, but to the toe of the shoe. So that whole piece there is not originally hollow, and I had to use a Dremel to hollow that out. And you can see here that there's kind of an outline of a shoe, and that's because there's little ledges or lips that connect with the bottom of the SHF shoe. So the bottom of the shoes are separate pieces from the toe and the original shoe, and I had to sand that down. Same with the other side, and then glue the toes back on after I'd hollowed that portion out. And I mean, things don't often work out this perfectly, but they happen to fit just like Cinderella. They're not loose at all, yet they are really easy to take on and off. You just have to pull at the heel. So now we have the entirety of the lower armor, and we have to put on the top armor. These are the shoulder pads. These are really easy to remove from the SHF. They just kind of plug in to the little hinge right here. And the reason I have this microfiber cloth glued here, not only does it kind of provide an illusion that that's where they connect, but that's originally what I had done. I connected them to the torso armor kind of as one piece, because that's how it's done in the movie. It's kind of like football armor or something like that. I don't know, I've never played football, so that might not be accurate at all. But that didn't really allow for much range of motion because the fabric isn't very stretchy, doesn't have a whole lot of give, so the point of connection needed to be kind of back there. Anyway, and I just had a lot of extra length of cloth, and then the shoulder pads didn't fit quite snugly on the shoulders, and they kept falling off all the time. So what I decided to do is I got this brown elastic cloth from Etsy, and this is super useful. I actually got some more of it for use in other things because you never know when you're going to need to connect pieces of armor. And this, I just glued it through the inside of the shoulder pad, and it's very stretchy so that you can slide it up over the shoulders, and it keeps it snug against the body. So we'll just slide it over the arm and make sure that we keep the sleeve pulled down. Get it right there under his armpit. And another nice thing about this is that because it's such a similar color, it doesn't really stand out, and it's also at the armpit, so it's hidden in that way too. You can also kind of adjust it, so if you don't want it to hang really low, you can pull it up and the elastic will just kind of keep it wherever you want it to be. Next up is the bicep armor slash the elbow hinge. So with these guys, I just had to pop them off the bicep and glue them back together, but I also had to sand them out quite a bit, and I had to use an X-Acto knife to get this whole section taken out because there's plastic in there originally, but the jacket is supposed to be showing through those in the SHF, so I did what I had to do, even though that compromises the structural integrity of these guys. Fortunately, they haven't ever broken back here. They do tend to separate at this top seam line here. They just slide up onto the arm, And you gotta pull the shoulder armor out of the way and simultaneously pull the sleeve down so that it doesn't bunch up. But once it's on there, you don't have to worry about it. It just stays on, no problem. Never have had any problems with it sliding down. Okay, moving on to the forearm armor. Just like with all the other armor pieces, I popped it off the SHF, did a little bit of sanding and took off the pegs so that an actual arm could slide through these. With these, I also added the microfiber cloth painted to look like leather, and that just improves the friction, but it also makes it a little more difficult for them to get on. You have to use tweezers to get up under the sleeves and pull them through. Anyway, the reason that I have this black wire here is because there's supposed to be a wire that connects to the flamethrowers, and it's supposed to connect kind of through the back. I'm not really sure if it connects to the motor at the back or where, but having them connected makes it so that this wire will not be pulled out if you articulate the arms. So if you move the elbows up, it'll just kind of pull on that. I'll demonstrate that later when I get this on. But speaking of the flamethrowers themselves, I used an X-Acto knife to cut out the plastic that was in between these, and that just makes it look a little bit more realistic. And for this tank here, I also just drilled a tiny hole into the opening of the tank and a tiny hole through the armor here, and just ran a little wire through there, glued it right at the bottom. And also, speaking of this piece here, this actually came out to about here, and I just used a circular saw on the Dremel to cut that off, and it's really hard to tell. Even though I didn't actually end up painting that edge there, it's really hard to tell that there was ever any extra metal there. And to put these on, just slide it through. Like I said, the fabric inside the armor tends to catch on the sleeves, so I just get some tweezers and hold it there. And do the same for the other side. This one is quite a bit tighter though, so it's a little harder to get in there with the tweezers. And grab the sleeves. And then this black wire here, I'll put it underneath the shoulder armor. So that holds it in place, and then the armor at the back will hide this wire. But having a little bit extra of it means that when you articulate the arms, that it's not going to be causing any stress at the point of connection here, and there's enough so that you can articulate both arms going forward at the same time. The only downside is that it makes it a little bit more complicated to put on, and this wire might ride up at the back of the neck sometimes and I have to push it down. But it's really not that big of a deal, especially because the shoulder pads help keep the wire in place. Now for the hands, I have modified these so that they can work on the Notaman. Before, they were meant to be on a tiny little SHF peg, but I have not only widened the peg, but I've also drilled down into the glove so that the ball hinge here can fit deep down into the hand, and it just pops on. There's a little pop, and that will also keep the armor from coming off. And then this one, the peg, actually I've modified it so that it's a little bit easier to get on, but it also means that it's easier for the hand to fall off. So it kind of just sits on like that, and if I bend the arm at all, the hand tends to pop off pretty easily. So I might go in and just replace that forearm with just the stock Notaman arm, because I've got a bunch of those bodies laying around. I've also detached this hand cover here from the forearm armor and attached it to the hand. I don't know if that's how it's supposed to be in the movie, but I know that's how it is in the Hot Toys, which is a lot of what I used as reference. And it does kind of allow for some hand articulation that wasn't there before. There's actually one little detail that I need to talk about before I put on the torso armor and the helmet. There's this little tiny neck sleeve that I've made out of the hem of the coat. And the reason for this is that Tony, it's a little tiny detail in the movie, but Tony, right before he puts on the armor, he has this little leather neck protector thing that he wraps around. And this little guy just slides right onto the neck. And the neck goes on the body, and then I usually pull the collar of the jacket underneath the back of his helmet, so it kind of keeps everything a little closer together, like that. And you've probably noticed this, but there's just constant readjusting that has to go with this guy, because the armor will slide down and the hands will fall off, the clothes will get out of place. There's just a lot of futzing that goes on into making this guy look as good as he can be, but it's worth it. So the torso armor is one of the more complicated pieces of the entire thing, mostly because there are some hinges right here that I've created. So originally this was all molded together, so this piece and these pieces here, this was all one piece, not including these bottom pieces. You can see that there's seam lines here, and what I had to do was go in with an X-Acto knife, and just, this plastic is so hard and so brittle, so I had to just little by little just kind of rock the X-Acto knife back and forth until I could get some cuts in there, and just very, very slowly and gradually cut around. The outer pieces are connected to the trap armor, and the inner hinges are connected to this. And the axle that I've used for the hinge, I just drilled a tiny little hole, and then I used a little needle and stuck the needle down in there, and it was, man, it was hard to get these hinges to be connected. There's an alarm going on outside, sorry about that. Oh, that's all I had to do was say it. But the hinges being here allow the armor to be removable, so that it kind of just clamps around his body. If not, I don't know how I would have gotten this on. I think I would have just had to kind of glue it on all together and have it not be removable. But the hinges really add some realism, and they add some functionality, which is kind of a theme for this guy. I also added this elastic strap underneath on the traps so that the armor wants to close around his body, so it keeps it snug and allows me to position this lens right over the arc reactor. The lens is a 6mm laser focusing lens for green lasers that I got on eBay. Super high quality lens, it's real glass, and it happened to be just the right size for the arc reactor that comes with the SHF. So I've got a lot of the microfiber cloth glued underneath here to keep the arc reactor in place. I've also got some wires that go in through the bottom of the arc reactor housing. Now the back of the armor, this is where the engine is, and again, it's just a piece of the SHF that I've taken off, sanded down, and I sanded this one down quite a bit so that the button here can fit into that little space and not poke out so far from the body. And I've just attached it using some more of that cloth and some elastic cloth as well, so that it stays in the right place. I've also added quite a few wires here and there to just add some realism. This is a real wire, and these two are real wires, and this is a real wire. I've also added a spare button switch because I sanded off too much of this side. When I was sanding everything down, I didn't stop to consider that the battery housing would only be right here, so I didn't need to sand all this down, so it looked pretty empty. So that's just a little component that I put there. Looks like I actually need to glue it back down because it's coming off. And then the way this attaches to the figure is very simple. Just place it over the head, line up the battery housing so that it fits into that little hole. And then I'll just turn the light on so that don't have to worry about that later. And then these little wires just tuck down into the thigh armor. And you can see the light shining through the lens there. Now the very final piece that I'm going to talk about, you would think this would be pretty simple, but I'll actually talk about the whole head process now before I put this on. So this is the Man Nipple Studio head, and the hair does not look like this when you get it. So I actually took off this separate piece, sanded down the whole back of the head at the cranium so that this back part of the helmet could fit on. I also had to sand out the inside of this, because if you take apart the SHF, you'll see that this is not perfectly smooth and hollow on the inside, neither is the back part. It all kind of has little pegs and ridges to fit all together. So I had to sand everything down so that it could fit just to start, and then I had to use an X-Acto knife to cut in some hair details, which do not look super great. You can see some of them there. And it was a ton of trial and error just to get this to fit in there, and then to make it look good was even harder. And you can see I've got some more of that cloth up here because he kind of got like a medieval squire hat to protect his head. And the helmet is a little bit loose on there. It's attached mainly to the cloth, which is attached to the head. Originally it wasn't like that. It was all very secure, but somewhere along the way it kind of got loose from the glue. And I had to reposition this hair. I also had to repaint, not repaint, but add some more paint for some 5 o'clock shadow on his beard. Just used some brown acrylic and a tiny little brush to add all of this detail. Let's see how close we can get here. Oh yeah, getting real up close and personal here. You can see all of that added paint detail and all of the terrible X-Acto knife work that I did to add some hair detail. I also had to cut off a little bit of the ears because they were just flared out a little bit too much so that they could fit around the helmet. Now the faceplate itself, I had to sand that out, and one of my big concerns was that his nose was going to get super scratched up, or at least the paint would rub off. And maybe that's happened to a degree. It does look a little bit more shiny than the rest of the face, but I sanded that part down quite a bit more than the other parts with that in mind. I also sanded down the mouth so that I could use an X-Acto knife, a brand new X-Acto knife, mind you, to cut out all of the little mouth holes. So those are actual holes in there that were not there before. And then I left a little bit of the peg there so that there's a little bit more security. But you just pop that right on. It attaches at the top here, and it has some security with those pegs and doesn't come off. And another fun factor about this is that you can raise the faceplate and it stays in place. So this is kind of, I mean, the whole thing is probably one of my crowning customs that I've ever done. But the faceplate, I'm super, super happy with how this came out. This is kind of the inspiration for doing this custom, is that I wanted to use the man nipple head and see if I could get it inside the SHF armor. And then I just kind of went all the way, adding the other base body and all the extra details and stuff. Just another note about the light. I actually added some acrylic paint to the LED because it was super, super, super bright. It was really hard to look at. Every time I would turn it on, I wouldn't be able to look at the figure because the light was so bright, especially coming through there. Now I've dimmed it down a little bit. The only downside of that is that you can tell if you look closely that there are kind of some imperfections in the thickness of the paint, which causes it to look a little bit warped. But that's not a huge deal, especially in pictures. It just comes across as kind of just a bright circle, so you can't really see those details, but under this bright light, you can tell that it's not quite perfect under there, but not a huge deal, like I said. And here is the Mark 1 completely built. I'm so happy with how this came out. All of the little details and the fact that you can take it completely apart, that it's actually a little guy in some armor. The articulation is not that bad with the armor on. You can get the legs up a decent amount, probably what you would expect an actual guy wearing this armor to do. The double bend at the knee is still pretty good. You get a little tiny bit past 90. And let's see, is it the same for the other side? You can kind of shift the armor down and the leg can get up. Yeah. And then you've got all the wires that kind of want to pop in and out, but those can be fudged around. You could even just completely remove that wire if that was really annoying. At the ankles, I mean, there's not a whole lot to begin with, but what's there is preserved. And at the arms, you can lift them up this way. And you can also put them forward quite a bit. You can also bend the elbows. Gets to about 90. You can go more, but then the armor gets pushed up further and then the hands pop off. But all the armor can kind of be shifted around to get more articulation if you really want to go for it. Like, I think the hand just got popped off just there. And then the head, you get a little bit of neck action and you get (360° or at least 180° rotation. Surprisingly, for the Notaman bodies, the torso articulation is not great. Maybe it's because the plastic is so rubbery and it's got a lot of friction, but especially with this armor on, I don't really want to try doing any torso articulation. With all the armor, there's the possibility that if I squeeze in the wrong place, it could break, or at least pop at the seams, and I'd have to re-glue it. There's not a whole lot of places that you can grip and get the leverage that you need to push it into that position. I mean, I can try to go forward a little bit like that, but it's mostly just coming from the hips. So it's got pretty limited articulation, but about what you'd expect for the Hot Toys and maybe about what you'd expect for the guy in the actual stunt suit. For accessories, he comes with what the SHF comes with, the flamethrower accessories, and an extra pair of hands. He also comes with a dynamic base. With these hands, I've modified them so that they can also fit onto the Notaman body, but they don't really work, especially with the armor on, for this hand because I've glued the armor to the fist, and then they don't really fit within this armor. It would be kind of a pain to get it in there anyway, so I mostly just stick with the fists. And then unfortunately, a long time ago, one of these flamethrower accessories was broken. It just kind of snapped at the connection point. I actually modified it so that it could fit onto there. But since I've sort of compromised the structural integrity by taking out this part of the flamethrower, it doesn't really work anymore because this plastic is pretty flimsy and rubbery. So the flamethrower tends to droop if I put it on there. However, this flamethrower is fully functional. That's how it's supposed to look. And it just slides right onto there. And you get a really cool effect. So at least I have one functional flamethrower. For the size comparison, here he is with the Comic Cave Mark 46 and the Fantascraft Mark 85. As you can see, he's just a tiny bit smaller than these guys, and that's because I overcorrected when I was trying to correct his height. He used to be about maybe that big, so he was significantly taller than both of these guys, and now he's just a smidgen smaller, and depending on the angle, you can kind of make it look like he's the same exact height as them. When you put up the visor, that also kind of helps with the height difference. But I'm totally okay with it. If I really wanted to, I could go in and replace the legs with some stock Notaman legs and then get it to the exact right height that I want. But the fact that it's this close, and the Mark 85 and the Mark 46 probably should be a little bit taller than the Mark 1, even though the Mark 1 is shot to look really big, he's really just wearing regular shoes with like a tiny little piece of metal underneath the shoes. So if you're wearing a full Iron Man armor with all of the electronics and stuff that go into the boots, you should be a tiny bit taller than the Mark 1. So I'm totally okay with the height, and I think he works really well with both of these figures.